She held my hand at the graveside, my daughter-in-law, tears running down her face, squeezing my fingers like she meant it. And I remember thinking, this woman genuinely loved my son. This woman is family now. I was 63 years old, standing in a cemetery outside Barrie, Ontario in February, burying my wife of 31 years. The ground was frozen. The pastor's breath came out in little clouds. My son stood on my left, and his wife stood on my right, and I thought, at least I'm not alone. At least I still have them. I had no idea what was already being planned. My wife Carol died of ovarian cancer. She fought it for 2 years, and she fought hard the way she did everything. Quietly, stubbornly, without making a fuss. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to finish the crossword and watch the 6 o'clock news and have her tea at exactly the same time every evening, right up until she couldn't anymore. I loved her for that. I still do. After she passed, this house felt like a place I'd never lived in. 31 years of memories, and suddenly, none of them had anywhere to land. I'd walk into the kitchen in the morning and reach for 2 mugs before I remembered. I'd hear something on the radio she would have liked and turn to say something and catch myself. Grief does that. It makes you stupid with forgetting. My son, I'll call him by his relationship to me throughout this because that's what matters here. My son called me every few days in those first weeks. How are you eating, Dad? Are you getting out? Do you need anything? It felt good. It felt like he was stepping up, the way you hope your kids will when things get hard. He's 34. He works in logistics. Manages a warehouse operation near Mississauga. His wife works in HR. They have a little girl, my granddaughter, who was 4 at the time, and who I would crawl through fire for without blinking. They'd been renting an apartment in Mississauga for a few years, nothing fancy. I knew they were saving up. About 3 months after Carol died, my son came to visit alone. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had 10,000 family dinners, and he said, "Dad, I'm worried about you out here by yourself." And I said, "I'm all right." And he said, "You're 2 hours from us. What if something happened? What if you fell in the middle of the night?" I told him I was 63, not 93. I still drove. I still did my own groceries. My neighbor Paulette checked in on me. I had the church. I had my Thursday morning card game with a few men from the neighborhood. I was managing. But he kept coming back to it. Over the next few visits, he and his wife both worked on me. Wouldn't it be nice to be closer to the grandkids? Wouldn't it be nice to have family around? The little one misses you, Dad. She asks about you all the time. That part was true. My granddaughter did ask about me. And that, I think, is what finally cracked me open. Not fear, not loneliness. Love. The simple, uncomplicated love of a 4-year-old who wanted her grandfather nearby. So when my son suggested they move in with me, I said yes. It was framed as temporary, just until they saved enough for a down payment, 6 months, maybe 8. They'd help with expenses. My daughter-in-law would be around during the day, which meant I wouldn't be alone in the house. It made sense. I told myself it made sense. They moved in on a Saturday in late May. I helped carry boxes. My granddaughter ran through the halls of the house like she owned the place, which made me laugh for the first time in months. We had a barbecue that evening. Burgers, potato salad, the works. My son put on the hockey game. I remember thinking Carol would have loved this. A full house again. The first few months were fine. Not perfect. We were all adjusting, but fine. My daughter-in-law cooked dinner most nights, which I appreciated. My granddaughter and I developed a routine, reading together before her nap on weekends, walking to the park 2 streets over. My son handled some things around the yard I'd been putting off. It felt like family. It felt like the arrangement was working. Then small things started to shift. It happened gradually enough that I almost didn't notice. My daughter-in-law began making comments about the house, how it was dated, how the layout wasn't practical for a family, how the master bedroom really should be theirs, since I was up and down all night anyway, and my presence was disturbing the baby's sleep schedule, which was rich, considering my granddaughter slept at the opposite end of the house from me. But I moved into the smaller bedroom. It was easier than arguing. Then there were comments about my things. My chair in the living room was in the way. My tools in the garage were cluttering up their space. They'd bought a car and needed room. My books, which I'd had on the shelves in the den for 20 years, were boxed up one afternoon while I was out. When I came home and asked about them, my daughter-in-law said she was just reorganizing. She'd get to them. She never did. My son, when I brought these things up, would get a particular look on his face, uncomfortable, caught between something. He'd say she didn't mean anything by it, that she was just trying to make the house work for everyone. He'd say I was being sensitive. Once, when I pushed back a little harder, he said maybe I should think about whether all this space was really practical for one person. For one person. I let that settle for a minute, and then I asked him, as gently as I could because I didn't want to fight, whose name was on the title of this house. He didn't answer. What I didn't know yet was that he'd already been to see someone, a real estate lawyer. Not to ask questions, to understand the process of adding a name to a title. My neighbor Paulette told me later. Her husband had run into my son at a coffee shop near the law office, and my son had mentioned, casually, that he was sorting out some paperwork on the house. I didn't find out about that coffee shop conversation for another 2 months. What I found out about first was the bank. I'd gone into the TD branch in town to sort out a pre-authorized payment that had come off twice in 1 month. While I was there, the woman at the counter asked if I'd like to review my account details, make sure everything was current. I said sure, and she pulled up my file and said, just to confirm, are you still wanting to keep the secondary account holder? I said I didn't have a secondary account holder. She looked at the screen, then back at me. Then she said she'd need to get the branch manager. What I learned that afternoon was that 4 months earlier, someone had submitted a request to add a name to my checking account. The request had gone through a branch in Mississauga. It had been processed. The name added was my son's. I sat in that manager's office for a long time. She was very kind. She explained the process for removing someone, what documentation I'd need, what she could do right then, and what would need to go through head office. I was listening, but part of me was somewhere else entirely. I was back at that kitchen table. I was at the graveside in February, holding a hand I thought was holding mine back. I didn't say anything to my son that evening. I came home, I made dinner, I read to my granddaughter. I said goodnight, and then I sat in that small bedroom that used to be the guest room, and I thought about Carol. Carol would have known. She always had a way of reading people, of seeing the thing underneath the thing. She'd had reservations about my daughter-in-law from the beginning. Never anything she could point to, exactly. Just a sense. She'd mentioned it once, carefully, and I'd told her she was being unfair. I thought about that now. I also thought about a conversation I'd had with our family lawyer, a man named Archibald Rowe, about 2 years before Carol died. We'd done our wills then, updated the beneficiaries, that sort of thing. He'd asked if we'd ever considered a living trust. He said for a property like ours, owned outright, significant equity, one child, it was worth thinking about. It avoids probate. It gives you more control over what happens to your assets while you're still alive. I said I'd think about it. And then Carol got sick and I stopped thinking about most things except her. I thought about it now. The next morning, I called Archibald's office and made an appointment. I told him the broad strokes. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He said there were several things we could do. The most immediate, he said, was to establish a revocable living trust and transfer the property into it, naming myself as the trustee. That would effectively remove the house from anything that could be claimed or contested. It would no longer be in my name as a simple title. It would be held in trust, managed by me, for my benefit during my lifetime, with instructions for what happened afterward. He also asked if I wanted to remove my son from the bank account. I said yes. He said he could provide documentation to the bank. We made an appointment for the following week. I want to be clear about something. I did not do any of this out of spite. I'm not built that way. I did it because I am 63 years old and I have worked every year since I was 17. I spent 22 years with the municipality, public works, infrastructure, and then another decade with a private contractor before I retired. That house was bought with Carol's income, and mine, dollar by dollar, over the better part of 15 years. We paid it off. We owned it free and clear. It was the one thing we'd managed to build that was entirely ours. And I was not going to let it be taken from me by people who moved in under the banner of love. The week before my appointment with Archibald, I found the folder. My son had left his laptop open on the kitchen table. He does that, leaves things everywhere, and I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was moving it to wipe down the table, and the screen was open to a document. A typed document with what looked like notes. I read the first few lines before I knew what I was reading. It was a summary. Timeline, it said at the top. Then, current title status. Steps for spousal exception under Ontario family property rules. Notation that the father has no other children. Notation that the current will names the son as sole beneficiary. Notation. And this is the line I keep coming back to. Once in care. Unlikely to contest. Once in care. They were planning to put me in a care facility. I stood at that kitchen table for a long time. I didn't move the laptop. I didn't take a picture. I just read what was there, and I made sure I understood it, and then I closed the screen and I went and sat in my car in the driveway for 45 minutes. I cried. I'm not embarrassed to say that. I cried for the version of this I'd believed in. The family dinners, the barbecue, the little girl running through the halls. I cried for my son, who I'd raised differently than this, or thought I had, and then I stopped crying. Because I had things to do. I called Archibald from the car and asked if we could move the appointment up. We met on a Thursday. I brought everything he'd asked for. The deed, the account statements, Carol's death certificate, the will. We went through it carefully. He explained the trust structure clearly, walked me through what it meant for the property, what my rights were, what my son's rights were not. We drafted the trust document that afternoon. The transfer itself, moving the title into the trust, required registration with the Ontario Land Registry. Archibald handled the paperwork. He filed it electronically. He sent me a confirmation at 11:47 at night because he'd submitted the batch filing late that evening after his last appointment. I was awake when it came through. I read it 3 times. The property was no longer titled in my personal name. It was held in the Walter J. Thornton Living Trust. My name, my trust, my terms. I also, through Archibald's office, had my son formally removed from my bank accounts at TD. I opened a new account at a different branch and moved the bulk of my funds. I updated the pre-authorized payments. I changed my online banking passwords. I reviewed my will. Not changed yet, I wasn't sure as I was ready to change it. But I put a note in the file with Archibald that I'd be in touch. Then I went home and I made supper. My son came in around 6:30, the way he usually did. Sat down. Looked at his phone while I cooked. My granddaughter came and tugged on my sleeve and asked if we were having the pasta with the cheese on top, which is her favorite. And I said, yes, sweetheart, tonight we're having the pasta with the cheese on top. My daughter-in-law set the table. We ate. It was normal. It was entirely, completely normal. I had decided I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. I wanted to wait and see what they did when they discovered the transfer, because they would discover it eventually, either through the bank or through a conversation with their lawyer. And when they did, I wanted to see who came through that door. It took 11 days. My son came home from work on a Tuesday looking like he'd swallowed something wrong. He sat down across from me in the living room and he said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said he'd heard from someone that there'd been some changes to the property records. He said he wasn't sure what it meant. He said he was confused. I said, "What specifically are you confused about?" He said he thought we'd been talking about the future of the house, about what made sense, about family. I said yes, I'd been thinking about exactly that. Then I told him what I'd done. I told him about the living trust. I told him about the bank account. I told him about the timeline document on his laptop. I told him I knew what once in care meant and what it was meant to set up. He went very pale. He said he could explain. He said the document was from months ago, before they'd even moved in, just something they'd been thinking through. He said his wife had been worried about what would happen to the house if something happened to me, and they'd just been trying to plan. He said he never meant for it to go anywhere. He said, "Dad, I promise you, I never meant for it to go anywhere." He was crying by the end, and here's the thing. I believe he was telling at least part of the truth. I believe he loves me. I believe some part of him, maybe a large part, had not fully understood what his wife was moving them toward, or had understood and looked away, which is its own kind of failure, but not quite the same thing. I'm 63. I've known enough people to know the difference between the man who plans the crime and the man who drives the car without asking where they're going. But I also know it doesn't matter. What matters is that the house is mine. What matters is that I am not going anywhere I don't choose to go. What matters is that my granddaughter will still come and read books with me on Saturday mornings, and that I will still make the pasta with the cheese on top, and that when I am done with this house and this life, what I leave behind will go where I decide it goes. My son and his wife moved out 6 weeks later. We didn't have a dramatic scene. I asked them to find another arrangement, and they did, which I think tells you something. There were tears, and there were things said that I don't need to repeat here. My daughter-in-law did not apologize, which also tells you something. My son calls me now, once a week. It's uncomfortable, and it's short, and I think we're both trying to figure out who we are to each other now. I don't know how that story ends. I hope he figures out who he wants to be before it's too late to be that person. I raised him better than what happened in this house, and I have to believe that person is still in there somewhere. My granddaughter came to stay with me for 3 days in July. We went to the park. We had the pasta. We walked to the little beach at the end of the road, and we watched the ducks, and she held my hand the whole way home. Carol's photo is back on the mantle, where it belongs. My books are back on the shelves in the den. My chair is in the living room, in front of the window, exactly where it was for 15 years. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, if you're older, if you own something, if you've spent a lifetime building something, and you're thinking about trusting it to people who've given you reason to wonder, please talk to a lawyer. Not because your family is bad, not because mine is, but because love and legal protection are not the same thing, and learning that difference on the wrong side of the paperwork will cost you everything. I did what I had to do, and I would do it again.